Have you ever wondered why the moment you stop tolerating disrespect, everything around you begins to shift? Why the same person who ignored you, dismissed you, or acted like your feelings didn't matter suddenly starts paying attention the moment you pull back? It feels confusing at first, almost unfair, because in your mind, respect should have been given from the beginning, not earned through silence, not triggered by absence, not awakened by distance. But human behavior doesn't always follow fairness. It follows psychology, deep, unconscious patterns that most people never notice until it's too late. And when you understand these patterns, you stop reacting from emotion and start moving with power. Disrespect is not just a moment, it is a message. It tells you how someone perceives your value in that moment, not your real worth, but the value they believe you will accept. And here is where most people lose themselves. They try to fix disrespect with more effort, more explanation, more emotional energy, more chasing, more proving. But the mind doesn't respect what is overgiven. It starts to take it for granted, slowly, quietly, without warning. And this is where avoidant behavior becomes important to understand. Avoidants are not always the villains. They are often people who struggle with emotional closeness. They pull away when things get too intense, too real, too emotionally demanding, not because you are not enough, but because connection triggers discomfort inside them. But here is the dangerous part. When you react emotionally to their distance or disrespect, you unknowingly confirm their pattern. You become predictable, easy to read, easy to control, easy to dismiss and return to when convenient. And every time that cycle repeats, something breaks inside you. Not just trust, not just patience, but self-respect. Because deep down, you start questioning your own value. You start asking yourself why your presence feels optional to them, but essential to you. And that question slowly becomes pain. But pain has a hidden purpose. It is not here to destroy you. It is here to wake you up. Because there comes a moment in every person's life where tolerance turns into transformation, where silence becomes stronger than explanation, where distance becomes louder than pleading, and where self-respect finally becomes more important than being understood. That is the moment everything changes. Because when you stop reacting to disrespect, you stop feeding the cycle that keeps you stuck in it. When you stop over-explaining your worth, you start rebuilding it. And when you stop chasing emotional validation, you start regaining emotional control. This is not about becoming cold. It is not about becoming distant just for revenge. It is about becoming emotionally unshakable. And that is exactly what most people never learn. They think power is loud. But real power is quiet. It doesn't argue. It doesn't beg. It doesn't chase. It simply shifts energy. And when your energy shifts, people feel it before they understand it. That is why those who once ignored you often start noticing you when you finally stop trying to be noticed. Not because you became more valuable overnight, but because you stopped making yourself available at a low price. Human psychology is simple in this way. We often value what feels emotionally expensive, what is not constantly available, what is not always accessible. And when someone who once had unlimited emotional access to you suddenly feels distance, it creates reflection, confusion, awareness. But here's what makes this even more powerful. You are not just learning how to deal with avoidance or disrespectful behavior. You are learning how to shift your entire emotional position in every relationship you will ever have. Because the real change is not in them. It is in you. It is in how you respond when you are ignored, how you act when you are misunderstood, how you behave when your emotions are not being prioritized. And that is where these silent moves come in. They are not loud. They are not aggressive. They are not designed to create drama or conflict. They are designed to restore something much more powerful than attention. They restore respect, and not just from others, but from yourself. Because once you experience what it feels like to stop chasing and start standing still in your own value, something shifts permanently. You stop begging for clarity from people who benefit from confusing you. You stop over-investing in those who undervalue you. And you stop reacting to behavior that no longer defines your emotional state. But to reach that level of control, you first need to understand what is really happening beneath the surface when someone disrespects you, and why silence, more than words, becomes the most powerful response you can ever use. And if you stay until the end, you will learn exactly how these 5 silent moves work, why they create regret and avoidant behavior, and how they help you rebuild a version of yourself that no longer gets pulled into emotional chaos, but instead commands quiet, undeniable respect. Why do some people seem emotionally present one moment and completely distant the next, almost as if connection itself triggers their need to disappear? This question confuses most people who experience inconsistency in relationships. One day there is attention, interest, even warmth. The next day, there is silence, distance, and emotional withdrawal that feels sudden and personal. But what looks like mixed signals on the surface often comes from a very specific internal wiring that has nothing to do with your worth and everything to do with emotional protection mechanisms. To understand this behavior, you need to step away from the idea that connection always means closeness in the same way for everyone. For some individuals, intimacy does not feel like safety. It feels like pressure. It feels like expectation. It feels like a loss of control over their internal world. This is where avoidant tendencies begin to form. Avoidant individuals are not simply people who dislike others. They are often people who learned through experience that emotional closeness can lead to discomfort, overwhelm, or even emotional dependency they do not feel prepared to handle. So instead of leaning in when connection deepens, they instinctively create space, not always because they want to hurt someone, but because their system equates distance with relief. And this is where most emotional misunderstandings begin. When someone with this pattern starts to feel emotionally close, something inside them activates a subtle alarm. It is not a conscious decision. It is an automatic shift. They begin to feel trapped, even if nothing is actually restricting them. They begin to sense expectations, even if none were clearly expressed, and in response, they withdraw to restore a feeling of independence. But from the outside, this withdrawal is experienced very differently. To the person on the receiving end, it feels like rejection. It feels like confusion. It feels like emotional whiplash. Because what was once connection suddenly becomes absence without explanation, and the human brain, especially the emotional part of it, struggles deeply with unfinished emotional patterns. We are wired to seek closure. We are wired to seek consistency. When we don't get it, the mind starts filling gaps with assumptions, and most of those assumptions are painful. I did something wrong. I am not important anymore. I am easy to replace. These thoughts do not reflect reality. They reflect uncertainty trying to find meaning. And this is exactly where emotional imbalance begins to grow, because instead of stepping back and observing the pattern, most people step forward with more effort, more messages, more explanation, more emotional investment. They try to bridge the distance by increasing intensity, believing that connection can be restored through persistence. But in avoidant dynamics, intensity often creates the opposite effect. The more emotional pressure is applied, the stronger the urge to retreat becomes. Not out of cruelty, but out of internal discomfort. The system that already values space begins to protect itself even more. And what follows is a cycle where one person moves closer while the other moves further away. Over time, this cycle creates imbalance. One side becomes emotionally overengaged, constantly thinking, analyzing, and trying to restore harmony. The other side becomes increasingly distant, not necessarily because they care less, but because closeness itself feels overwhelming. This is not a story of good or bad intentions, or it is a story of incompatible emotional responses. And once you understand this, something important changes inside you. You stop personalizing every withdrawal. You stop assuming every step back is a reflection of your value, and you begin to see behavior for what it actually is, rather than what it feels like. Because feelings are powerful, but they are not always accurate. Now here is where emotional intelligence begins to replace emotional reaction. When you stop chasing inconsistency, you interrupt the pattern. When you stop over-explaining your presence, you remove pressure from the interaction. And when you stop trying to force emotional alignment, you allow space for clarity to naturally appear. But most importantly, you begin to reclaim internal stability. Because the real damage in these situations is not the distance itself. It is the internal disruption it creates, the constant questioning, the emotional ups and downs, the loss of focus on your own life because attention becomes fixed on someone else's behavior. Avoidant patterns often pull people into a state of emotional dependency without them realizing it. You start monitoring responses. You start measuring interest. You start adjusting yourself based on unpredictability. And slowly, your emotional center shifts away from yourself. This is why understanding matters more than reaction. When you see the pattern clearly, you stop responding from confusion. You start responding from awareness. And awareness creates space between stimulus and response. That space is where control returns, because you are no longer reacting to absence as a threat. You are recognizing it as behavior with a psychological root. And once that shift happens, everything begins to reorganize internally. You stop over-investing in inconsistency. You stop attaching meaning to every withdrawal. And you stop trying to earn stability from someone who operates through fluctuation. Instead, your focus begins to return inward, and that is where the silent moves become powerful, not because they change the other person immediately, but because they change your position completely. They shift you from emotional dependency into emotional authority. But before those moves can take effect, there is something deeper you must recognize about how chasing impacts perceived value, and why your energy itself becomes the deciding factor in how you are treated moving forward. What happens when you keep giving attention to someone who is slowly pulling away from you? At first, it feels like effort, like patience, like trying to save something meaningful. But over time, something subtle begins to change in how that connection is perceived, not by you, but by the other person. And this shift is not emotional, it is psychological. Human perception of value is deeply connected to availability. When something is always accessible, the brain adjusts to it. It becomes familiar. Predictable, expected. And what is predictable is often no longer evaluated with the same emotional intensity as something uncertain or rare. This is where a quiet shift begins in many relationships without being noticed. When one person consistently reaches out, initiates contact, and maintains emotional effort, while the other remains inconsistent, the dynamic stops being balanced. Instead of mutual exchange, it becomes one-sided reinforcement. One side invests energy, while the other receives it without equal return. Over time, this creates an unconscious pattern in the mind of the one receiving more attention. They begin to associate your presence with certainty, and certainty, in psychological terms, reduces emotional urgency. This does not mean they dislike you. It means the emotional system no longer perceives your presence as something that requires effort or appreciation. It becomes part of the background. And once someone becomes part of the background, their actions start to carry less emotional weight. This is where overinvestment creates an unintended consequence. The more you try to secure connection through effort, the more you risk lowering perceived emotional value. Not because effort is wrong, but because imbalance removes tension. And without emotional tension, desire often weakens. At the same time, another psychological factor begins to take effect. The brain naturally responds to contrast. When someone is inconsistent, their presence feels more intense during moments of connection, and their absence creates emotional curiosity. But when someone is consistently available, that contrast disappears. Everything becomes steady, predictable, familiar, and familiarity, without balance, slowly reduces emotional activation. This is why chasing rarely produces the result people expect. It does not create deeper connection. It often creates emotional fatigue on both sides. One person feels overwhelmed, the other feels unfulfilled, and the gap between them keeps widening even while effort increases. But there is another layer to this dynamic that is even more important. When effort is not matched, emotional interpretation changes. The receiving side may begin to unconsciously assume that your availability will continue regardless of their behavior. Not out of malice, but because consistent presence signals reliability without boundaries. And when reliability is not balanced with emotional standards, it can slowly shift into expectation. Expectation replaces appreciation. And once appreciation is replaced by expectation, emotional engagement begins to decline. This is why some individuals only start to reflect on your importance when your presence becomes less predictable, not because absence creates value out of nowhere, but because interruption breaks the pattern they had become accustomed to. The mind notices change more than consistency, and change forces attention. But here is where most people misunderstand what is actually happening. They think the goal is to create loss or emotional discomfort in the other person. That is not the purpose. The real purpose is to restore internal balance in yourself, because constant chasing does not just affect how others see you, it affects how you see yourself. When your emotional state becomes dependent on external responses, your inner stability starts to weaken. Mood begins to fluctuate based on attention. Confidence begins to depend on replies. Focus begins to scatter across someone else's behavior instead of your own direction. This is not connection anymore. It is emotional dependency disguised as effort, and dependency always creates imbalance. The moment you step back from overgiving, something important begins to happen internally. You start to observe instead of react. You start to evaluate instead of assume. And slowly, emotional clarity begins to replace emotional urgency. This shift is not immediate, it is gradual, but it is powerful, because once you are no longer emotionally overextended, you begin to see patterns without distortion. You notice where energy was flowing without return. You recognize where effort was being used to compensate for inconsistency. And most importantly, you begin to understand where your presence was being taken for granted. This awareness changes how you move forward. Instead of trying to increase effort in places where it is not reciprocated, you begin to redirect attention toward stability. Instead of trying to fix emotional imbalance through communication alone, you begin to understand that behavior reveals more than words ever will. And this is where a deeper transformation begins. You stop measuring your value through response. You stop interpreting distance as failure. And you stop attaching meaning to inconsistent engagement. Because your internal reference point shifts, it is no longer based on how someone treats you in moments of convenience. It becomes based on how consistently you honor your own emotional boundaries. And once that shift happens, your energy changes completely. You no longer appear as someone trying to be chosen. You begin to operate as someone who chooses where to invest presence. And that difference is felt even without explanation, because emotional dynamics are not only shaped by action, they are shaped by direction of attention. And when attention is no longer scattered, but intentional, everything starts to reorganize around it. But this is only the beginning of the silent transformation, because once emotional balance is restored, the next step is learning how to respond in ways that do not create conflict, but instead establish unspoken boundaries that completely reshape how you are treated moving forward. When emotional intensity is no longer your reaction, something powerful begins to form inside you, a shift that cannot be seen from the outside, but is deeply felt in every interaction you have. It is the moment you stop being controlled by emotional impulses and start observing everything with clarity instead of reaction. This is where emotional detachment begins to take shape. Emotional detachment is not about becoming numb. It is not about shutting down feelings or pretending that nothing affects you. It is about creating space between what you feel and how you respond. That space is where control returns. That space is where awareness grows. And that space is where you stop being pulled into cycles that drain your inner strength. Most people live inside immediate reaction. Something happens and they respond instantly. A message is ignored and frustration rises. A tone feels different and insecurity appears. A delay occurs and assumptions take over. Life becomes a chain of emotional reactions that happen without pause. But reaction is not the same as power. Reaction is automatic. It is driven by impulse. It is shaped by fear, expectation, and attachment to outcomes. And when life is lived in reaction mode, other people's behavior begins to dictate internal stability. Detachment breaks that pattern. It introduces pause where there was none before. It allows observation before response. It gives the mind time to interpret instead of immediately react. And in that pause, something important happens. You stop becoming a reflection of other people's behavior, and you start becoming the source of your own emotional direction. This is not emotional distance in the sense of coldness. It is emotional balance. It is the ability to stay centered regardless of external inconsistency. It is understanding that not everything requires immediate attention, and not every situation deserves emotional energy. When this begins to develop, your perception of situations changes completely. Things that once triggered strong emotional reactions begin to feel smaller. Moments that used to create confusion start to feel clear. and interactions that once controlled your mood no longer have the same impact, not because the situations changed, but because you changed the way you process them, and this internal change alters everything around you. People begin to notice a difference in your presence, not because you are trying to act differently, but because you are no longer emotionally exposed in the same way. You are no longer easily pulled into emotional turbulence. You are no longer quick to overreact or overextend. This creates a new form of presence, a stable one, a grounded one, and stability carries weight. When someone no longer reacts immediately to emotional shifts, they become harder to read. And what cannot be easily read cannot be easily influenced. This does not come from strategy. It comes from internal regulation, from learning how to hold emotional space without collapsing into reaction. At the same time, detachment reduces internal noise. Without constant emotional overthinking, mental energy becomes available again. Instead of analyzing every interaction, your focus begins to return to your own direction. Instead of replaying conversations, your attention begins to move forward. Instead of questioning behavior, you start observing patterns without emotional attachment. This creates clarity. And clarity is powerful because it removes distortion. When emotions are constantly involved, perception becomes narrow. Everything is filtered through feeling. But when emotional distance is introduced internally, perception becomes wider. You start seeing situations from multiple angles instead of one emotional perspective. This allows better decisions, not faster reactions, but better responses. And responses are different from reactions. Responses are intentional. They are shaped by awareness. They come after observation, not before it. And this difference alone can completely change how you are treated in any interaction. Because when you stop reacting instantly, you stop reinforcing certain behaviors in others. You stop feeding patterns that rely on emotional predictability. And when predictability disappears, dynamics begin to shift naturally. There is also a deeper transformation happening beneath the surface. As emotional attachment to immediate outcomes decreases, self-focus increases, not in an ego-driven way, but in a grounded way. You begin to invest more energy into your own direction instead of external validation. You start building internal stability that does not fluctuate based on outside behavior. This is where emotional independence starts forming, and emotional independence changes the entire foundation of relationships. Because now, you are no longer entering interactions from a place of need. You are entering from a place of choice. And choice carries a completely different energy than dependency. One seeks approval, the other maintains direction. One reacts to uncertainty. The other observes without being controlled by it. And this difference becomes noticeable over time. People who are used to predictable emotional responses may begin to feel a shift. Not because anything dramatic was done, but because emotional reactions that once shaped the dynamic are no longer present in the same way. This absence of reaction creates space, and in that space, reflection often begins on its own. But the purpose of emotional detachment is not to create a reaction in others. It is to restore control within yourself. Because once emotional control is lost, everything external becomes amplified. But when emotional control is restored, everything external becomes manageable. And this is where real strength starts to form. Not in controlling others, not in forcing outcomes, but in controlling internal response regardless of external behavior. This is the foundation that all silent moves are built upon. Without emotional detachment, every other action still carries emotional weight. But with detachment, every action becomes intentional rather than reactive. And once you reach this level of awareness, you are no longer operating from emotional instability. You are operating from clarity, and that clarity becomes the beginning of unshakable self-respect.